Hello, hello, hello. My name is Rachel Silber, and I'm here in a different way. I would like to read to you my parents' testimony. I'm actually going to begin with my father. Both of my parents were born in Europe, Eastern Europe, of the 1930s. Um, as you well remember, there was a wave of hate and blame and rage that fueled destruction across Europe in general, and a lot in Eastern Europe, but Europe in general was devastated during World War II, which is kind of what happens when hate and separation and blame and aggression are left unchecked. And not only left unchecked, but the world believes them to be true rather than trusting our knowing, trusting our awareness. Sorry, some of these words may be a little different. I'm an access consciousness facilitator, and as such, that may be some of the lingo that I use. But as this is not something that's specifically access, and it is not specifically doing clearings and things like that, I just wanted to be here to read the words out loud, so that there is somewhere out in the world the testimony of my parents. So, my dad is a really cool guy. And this is him in the middle. I don't know if you can make that out. And his parents are right next to him. The picture of my grandfather is the only surviving picture that we had of him like this, portrait wise, um, because he perished in Kazakhstan during the war. Anyway, so let me get back to his story. This is my father's story, Harry Tzvi Silber. Let me see. His name is Harry Silber. His dad's name is Chaim Silber, born in 1898, passed away in Kazakhstan, 1943. His mom's name is Dina Silber. Her maiden name was Trompeter. Yes, just like the musical instrument. She was born in 1902 and passed away in 1999. And his sister passed away during the pandemic, Hanya Silber Pitsinyash. I'm used to calling her Pitsinyash. And so I just forget sometimes that she's a silly bear too. In any case, I showed you the picture of my dad surrounded by his two parents, and here we go. My name is Harry Tzvi Silber. Above is a photograph of me between my two parents. I'm reading from a doc, and so this is attached to that document. Photograph of me between photos of my parents. I was born in Rozvadov, Poland in 1934. My older sister, Hanya, was born in 1928 in Landshut, where my mother's family lived. And here's a photo of my mother's family, including most of her brothers. And here it is. Okay. Including most of her brothers, Hirsch, Kalman, Nahum, Yaakov, David, and Moshe, and her parents, Eliezer and Chava Trompeter. 4 of her brothers survived, 2 lived in Israel, and 2 lived in New York. The eldest, Hirsch, was sent to New York before World War I to avoid being conscripted to the Polish army. 3 of her younger brothers, actually 2 of the younger brothers, my grandmother's younger brothers, were part of the Polish army. 1 passed away in service. Here's another photograph of my father, Chaim Meir. And I'm going to have to show you guys this on my phone because I only have it digitally. Here's another photograph of my father, Chaim Meir, his brother Moshe, and his cousin Oizer, and his mother, Dvoira Silber, and my mother, Dina Silber, née Trompeter, seated next to my sister, Hanya. And as you can see, this is in the early 30s. And something that I've always found rather curious is my great-grandmother, Dvoira, is definitely not white. Makes me wonder, but she is the mom of two of these guys and the aunt of another. And it's just so curious to me as to how that came to be. I would love to know what her story is, but she passed away, like I said, in the early 30s, and none of us got to find out more about her, and most records were destroyed during the Holocaust as well. Anyway, the three boys were raised together like brothers since Oizer's mother passed away when he was a young age. Grandmother Dvoira was widowed for many years. She owned a grocery store just near the main square, and her son Moshe helped to manage it. They sold flour, rice, coffee, salt, sugar, candy, brooms. My parents lived with my grandmother when they first married in 1926. Later, they purchased a storefront home on the main square of Rozvadov. My grandmother Dvoira fell ill and passed away in 1933 or 1934. Rozvadov was a small, quiet town, and we lived a normal life behind our specialty store on the main market square. My parents were merchants and sold men's hats, cosmetics, perfumes, pens, ink, and fine stationery. Next to our shop was the Perlmutter's shoe shop. We had local customers and also customers among the people who were constructing the steel mill in Stalowa Wola. Every week when the market square was filled with people selling their wares, the vendors would ask my mother to touch their merchandise so it would sell quickly. Whenever we would go into a store or into a market stall, it seemed that suddenly more clients would arrive, so we were asked to have a seat and to please stay longer. When the war broke out in 1939, the Germans bombarded the area and tried to conquer Stalowa Wola. We escaped to small nearby villages in order to avoid the German bombardment. After the Germans conquered the area, we returned home for a short while. We were under the occupation of the German army, and everything was calm. The Germans purchased things at the store. They borrowed books from my father, and they brought us black German bread. Relations were amicable until the SS and the Gestapo arrived. With their arrival, blatant abuses began, like pogroms, severe taunting and cutting off the beards of Jews, and forcing them to sweep the streets and other tasks. There were also surprise aktions, roundups of Jews. My mother's brother David was sent by his mother from Landshut to Rozvadov to help our family out. After a while, the Germans decided to expel the Jews to the Soviet area of Poland. The community raised money to pay the commander to change his mind and let the Jews stay, and he did for just a few days longer. Then we were rounded up in the town square, and we were allowed to pack or take with us whatever it was that we could carry. Those who had carriages could carry more. My father hid our silverware, our Kiddush cups, and our candlesticks in a wooden crate that he buried beneath the woodshed in our backyard. He stacked all the fine men's hats in the cellar. My mother hid some jewelry in a jar and tucked it away. They hoped we'd be returning home one day very soon. We were told to march to the river sands, where we paid to be transported across in small boats, and we continued towards the Russian, Ukrainian border near Lvov. We stayed for nearly a year in forgive my mispronunciation, Briukovsky, Briukhovchy, Brusowicz, in a villa that we shared with several other families. The Soviets asked who's willing to give up his Polish citizenship to get Soviet papers. We wanted to remain Polish. One night, around midnight, the Russians loaded everyone who chose to remain Polish up on a 2-level freight train. We thought we were going to be sent back home, but instead, we traveled more than a month in the train heading towards Siberia. The Russian guards were on top of the train with machine guns to make sure that no one escapes. Once the train stopped in the Krasnoyarsk area, in the Tinskaya station, we were transported in horse-drawn carriages into the forest to forced labor camps. We lived in log cabin barracks in the forest for about a year and a half. The adults worked in the fields, in logging, and in collecting tree sap, of course without pay. We received meager portions of food. The children, however, were allowed to study. When Russia and Poland renewed diplomatic relations, we were then set free. We were asked to stay and keep working, though we were allowed to leave the place. My uncles, Moshe and David, joined the Polish army in exile, Anders' army, playing wind instruments. Remember, the last name was Trumpeter. They were playing wind instruments, and they were transported to Iran and later on to the British Mandate of Palestine. We walked through the forest to Tinskaya and from there to Kansk. We were told by other relatives who were in Jambul, Kazakhstan, that it was the warm lands, and that was very welcome after the freezing cold of Siberia. We had to work to save some money to be able to buy transportation tickets. My mother bought and sold odds and ends, and my father worked in a wood factory. And so we lived in Kansk for a little over 6 months. We arrived in Jambul, Kazakhstan in 1942. My father worked with his brother making woolen boots. Later on, he was a guard in a meatpacking plant. In November 1943, he fell ill, and my sister Hanya stepped in to fill his position, thinking he will be well again soon. Instead, he passed away, and Hanya was given another position, working in the kitchen. This allowed her to buy heads of sheep inexpensively, and my mother made goulash to sell. We lived in Jambul until after the end of the war. Since we were part of a military family, both my uncles serving in the Polish Free Army, though Moshe was accidentally electrocuted and killed, we were on the first transport from Jambul back to Poland. We arrived in Breslau in 1946. We could not return to our hometown of Rozvadov because the Poles organized pogroms against the Jews who returned home. My mother and my father's brother came to Rozvadov for one day and were warned to leave that night, lest they be found and killed. In Breslau, I joined the Zionist youth group, Gordonia. They arranged a bricha, a smuggling of Jewish kids from Poland to Germany. I was transferred to Berlin with a group of other children and lived there with no family contact for over 6 months. After that, we were smuggled to another children's camp in Bavaria. This was a children's displaced person camp, Sherit HaPlita, and was run by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration in Rosenheim. I was able to write to my mother to let her know my whereabouts. In 1948, my mother and sister were also smuggled out of Poland through Austria. On the journey, my mother became ill with typhus and was hospitalized for 3 months. Finally, my mother and sister arrived in Rosenheim, along with several parents of the other kids in the camp. After a few months, the camp was dissolved, and everyone either moved away or to the city. Although we had papers to go to America, we chose to make Aliyah to Israel, and we crossed the border to Italy and traveled further south until we reached the port of Bari. There, we boarded an orange-carrying boat. the Atzmaut, and sailed to Haifa in the summer of 1949. I'm going to take a little aside there just for a moment. Years later, when my father-in-law, who was also a survivor of the Holocaust, was visiting us at my parents' home, my father and he got in a conversation of how they made Aliyah to Israel, both of them. Turns out they were on the same boat, the same time, traveling together, one in third class and one on the upper deck. So they never met, and they had no idea that many years later they would have kids, and that those kids would meet and marry and give them grandkids, and they would find out that they happened to have been on the very same boat arriving in Israel in 1949. We spent a week in Shar Aliyah. We didn't have many relatives left alive after the war, but I did have two uncles in Israel. My mother's younger brother, Yaakov, was a Zionist and had been living in Palestine, the British Mandate of Palestine, since 1925. Her other brother, David, was with us in Siberia, and then he volunteered to be part of Anders' Polish army that reached Palestine via Iran. When they reached Palestine, he deserted the Polish army. He hid in a kibbutz, and he changed his name from Trompeter to Ben Eliezer. To contribute to the family, I worked in various jobs, doing odds and ends, avodot dachak, for lira 60. My mother's family had long worked in printing in Poland and had their own printing press, so my uncle arranged for me to work in the government printing office for 80 cents, 80 agorot. We lived for a few months in tents in a Bet Olim in Betlit, not far from Netanya. Afterwards, we moved into a ma'abara, a refugee camp in Abu Kabir. And as long as I'd known my grandmother, she lived in Tel Kabir, in Abu Kabir, as I called it. And while they began in wooden shacks, later on they lived in small, not so modern apartment buildings. But yeah, till the day of her death, that was where she lived. I was conscripted into the Israeli army in 1952 and served until 1955. In 1958, I married Sarah Gerecht and lived in Ramat Gan, Israel. I worked in the printing industry for many years, and in 1979, we moved our family to Houston, Texas, where we're still living. What I found so interesting as well with all of this, how much our family was colored by the experience, by living in Israel in the time of, as my father called it, Sena, where everything was limited. You had to have food stamps for things. They did all of that so that the country would be able to absorb the huge influx of refugees that had arrived in the country from everywhere, from not just Europe, but from all the various Muslim countries that expelled their Jews, and everyone had to be absorbed with very limited resources, kind of all at the same time. It's pretty amazing how you get this ragtag bunch of refugees from everywhere, and they never stayed refugees. They didn't pass refugee status from one generation to the next. They learned to work, to create, to do something different, to change something, to shift something, to grow. And that's a really beautiful exploration. So that is Harry's testimony. You know what? On the same Zoom, so I don't have to set up another one or the same StreamYard, I'm going to also do my mother's testimony. So that was Harry Silber, and this is for Sara Silber, my mama. Sara Silber, father's name Peretz Gerecht, mother's name Manya Gerecht. I was born in Lodz, Poland. Let me show you a picture of my mom from then. And actually, speaking of which, before I forget my dad's, I showed you the one of his family there, right? But we've also got that's them from a couple of years ago. My mom and dad, they're amazing people. This is from Germany after the war. You have my aunt Hanya, my grandmother Dina, and my dad. Okay. And these are my parents when they were dating. Pretty cool guys. I love these guys. They're amazing. And of course, they're always kind of naughty and smiling, and they're amazing people. Amazing. Okay. So this is the only pre-Holocaust picture we have of my mother with the white bow. This was taken about 2 months before World War II broke out. This is her younger brother, Gershon, who passed away on Liberation Day, and her older brother, Shimon. Okay. And there's an interesting story as to how we have this picture. When my grandmother's younger brother was conscripted to the Polish army, he had that photo that was just recently taken of his nephews. He had it in his pocket, and he went to war, and that was a little bit of the family that he had taken with him. And he went to fight and was wounded and was nursed to health in Romania by a farmer who found him, saw a Polish soldier who was wounded, and he hid that he was Jewish. He didn't say a word because, like now, there was rampant anti-Semitism then as well, and someone seeing a Jew would look at him very different than someone seeing a Polish soldier, much like what we see nowadays. Anyhow, we found him many years after the war, many years, like 40 or 50 years after the war. My grandmother and her younger brother found each other. And one of the things that he did was send her a copy of that picture, and hence we have that. I was born in Lodz, Poland, on February 2nd, 1937, to Manya and Peretz Gerecht. Originally, I was called Sabina. Later, after we moved to Israel, my name was changed to Sarah. My older brother, Shimon, was born in 1934, and my younger brother, Gershon, in 1939. You can see the three of us in this photo, which was taken in July 1939, just 3 months before the war broke out. My mother gave this photo to her younger brother, Jezik, a soldier in the Polish army, to have a memory of home and us when he left. Many years later, well after the war, when we were all adults, he found that we were alive and in Israel and sent us the picture. In 1940, my family moved to the ghetto in Lodz, which was established after the outbreak of the war. We lived there together with our grandparents, Arya Leib and Ita Rochel, and our cousins. All the Jews were forced into the ghettos. We were also forced to wear yellow stars on our clothes to easily be identified as Jews. My parents, Peretz, and Manya worked in the quote-unquote shops in the ghetto. Thinking thinking conditions in the Warsaw thinking that condition in the Warsaw ghetto may be better, in 1941 my father bribed the guards and transferred us from the Lodz ghetto to the Warsaw ghetto, where the Weintraubs, my mother's side of the family, lived. We thought that since Warsaw was a bigger city with a bigger Jewish community, things would be better there, but when we arrived, we saw even more desolation, hunger, and brutality. There were people dying and freezing on the streets. After a time when my father saw that this was no better for us, he bribed the guards with jewelry and valuables so that we could escape from the sealed ghetto. I remember my grandmother running after our carriage and crying. I never saw her again. We headed to the city of Piotrko Trybunalski, where we joined the open Jewish ghetto. In the open ghetto, Jews could go outside and work during the daytime and return home at night to sleep. My father tried to find a safe place for me and sent me to live with a non-Jewish family acquaintance of his, so I could pretend that I am part of their family. I lived as a non-Jew with them in the little village outside of Piotrko, but after a short while, the lady contacted my father to take me back. People were talking, and she was afraid to be discovered and to be punished. My father picked me up at night and hid me in a sack on his back. When a guard he walked past asked him what he was carrying, he said a goose for supper. My father, Peretz, worked at the Huta glass factory outside Piotrko Trybunalski ghetto. Having work was kind of a life insurance which protected us from deportation to the extermination camps. In Piotrko, there were many methodical roundups, actions, targeting specific groups of people, sometimes men, sometimes women, sometimes children. The Germans had to fill quotas. Once there was a particular roundup of women and children. When the word spread and reached us, my mother had just prepared a meager meal. Rather than eat, she put me up in a cubbyhole in the kitchen, covered by a thin curtain. She warned me not to make a sound or the German soldiers would find me and take me, and she ran to hide elsewhere with my baby brother in her arms. My father and my older brother were at the factory working. I remember the SS soldiers coming into the house searching for anyone who may be hiding there. As they were stomping about the house, they said, "Verfluchte Juden, alles was die have." Dirty Jews, look at everything they have. My mother's family was very, very wealthy, and that's how they were able to pay off various people. As long as they had some of their belongings, they were able to trade jewelry, silver, gold, diamonds, etc., for bread, for potato, for a way out. I could see them and hear them through the thin curtain. I was terrified, and I didn't make a peep. The soldiers didn't find me, but they stole all our valuables, the silver goblets and the silverware that we brought with us and we used to sell and to bribe and to help us survive. When the soldiers left, the cats ate the food that my mother had prepared, and I haven't liked cats ever since. At the end of 1942, there was another big aktion, another big roundup in Piotrko. A unit of Polish and Ukrainian policemen surrounded the ghetto and demanded all the Jews come out of their houses. They were all deported on trains going to the Treblinka extermination camp. Now there were less families in the ghetto. Those of the Judenrat, the Jewish policemen and their close friends, and the steady, vital workers of the Huta glass factory, including my family, the family of Peretz Gerecht. The beginning of 1943 marked the end of Ghetto Piotrko. The Nazis sorted the Jews and divided us basically into two groups. One group was immediately sent to the concentration camps, and my family belonged to the second group, which was sent in trucks to forced labor camp Pionki to work in a factory of munitions and explosives. My parents, Peretz and Manya, and my 9-year-old brother, Shimon, who passed as an adult midget, were all sent to work in the munitions factory. As vital workers, they received food coupons. We, the younger two children, hid in the dwelling unit and kept a very low profile. My mother used to smuggle small amounts of spirits, like a fuel, from the factory, um, from the factory production halls. She hid these in a small cloth pouch that she wore on her body. This was done at a huge risk because there were regular searches of the laborers, and they would kill anyone that they found smuggling. Luckily, she wasn't discovered. She sold the spirits back to Polish people who prepared alcoholic beverage from the liquids. In exchange for the spirits, she received a little food for her children, and that is how we survived. In July 1944, the labor camp of the Jews, which was called Krust, was surrounded by SS soldiers. The work at the factory stopped, and they also turned off the electricity and the water supply. The Red Army had already camped across the Wisla River, and every night the sound of cannons were heard and lights were seen in the near horizon. It was clear that 3,000 Jews of the camp were about to be evacuated. My father was a very aware man, and he prepared for that by digging a bunker under the floor of the barracks where we lived. On July 18th, 2,700 forced laborers from the Pionki camp were taken to the train station. The destination inscribed on the sticker that was attached to the side of the train wagon said Auschwitz. We managed to hide in the bunker. We spent several days under the ground, but with thirst and hunger, the nearby army, and our fear of being discovered by the Polish citizens who were searching the barracks for anything they could find, overpowered us. In the bunker with us were several other people, including a mother with a toddler. She covered his face so much to prevent him from crying or making noise that he suffocated. We thought we were already discovered, and we came out with our hands up and turned ourselves over to the Germans. Miraculously, we were left alive and joined a team of quote unquote experts who remained in the factory to dismantle the machines and the equipment for transferring them to the German rear front. As part of this group of quote unquote experts, we were in Pionki for about a month until every last screw was dismantled and packaged. After the adults loaded the marked cases on the cargo trucks, we were all deported on a cattle car train, destination Auschwitz. We were lucky that when our train arrived in Auschwitz, it was so overfilled with arrivals that they directed our train to continue onward. The train stopped several times on its way, and people were taken down from the train wagons. They were given work tools for digging defense pits and filling up sacks with sand under the supervision of SS soldiers in yellow uniforms. After several days of hard labor, we continued on, arriving in the city of Czeszowa. Good luck pronouncing, sorry. And from there, the train left Poland and we continued on to Germany. When we stopped and came off the wagons, a selection took place. The men were sent to the right, to the Sachsenhausen camp, and the women and children were sent to the left, to the Ravensbrück women's camp. Our family was separated for the first time since the war began. No one knew whether they would see the other again. We were lodged in a special barrack together with a large group of gypsies. We looked like scarecrows, with shaven heads and skinny bodies, with bleeding cuts. At the end of 1944, when the Red Army came closer to the Ravensbrück camp, both the Jews and the gypsies were transferred to the extermination camp Bergen Belsen. We were very weak, suffering from hunger, dysentery, typhus, and lice. There were dead and dying people all around us. When someone would die, others would rush over to open the body and eat it in order to survive. The air was heavy from the odor of excrement and decay and death. In April 1945, the British Army liberated the prisoners from Bergen Belsen concentration camp, and they were shocked that the Mussulmans who were crawling or lying down with their eyes wide open were actually people. They shared whatever food they had with us. My brother Gershon received a tube of condensed milk from a well-meaning British soldier. His body was too weak and too malnourished to process the rich, sweet milk, and he died. He was only 6 years old, and all he ever knew was war, famine, suffering, and hiding. My mother asked me to see if I could find where my brother was being buried. There were so many bodies pushed by bulldozers into mass graves, sprinkled with lime, and another layer of bodies was added on top. I couldn't find my little brother. And it's not here, but I know my grandmother was too weak. She had typhus and was too weak to move. Hence, she had sent my mom to find her, where her son would be buried. In order to clean up the concentration camp, some of the barracks were blown up by the British soldiers. A couple of soldiers came into the barracks where my mother and I were to carry out a table, and my mother, who was too weak to call out for help or stand or move, just waved her hand. The men called out that there are still people alive inside. We were taken to a hospital in Bergen. My older brother was taken there too. Later on, we were all part of a group of 200 people on the white bus transport to Sweden, arranged by Count Folke Bernadotte, so that we could receive continued treatment. My father returned to Poland after the liberation of Sachsenhausen by the Red Army and arrived on crutches in Lodz in search of us, but found no trace. He was very, very sick and was treated by his cousin, Berek Oster, who took care of him until his recovery. He was fed a lot of rhubarb to strengthen him. Once he grew stronger, he began to search, and in 1946, he discovered our names on the lists of the Red Cross. He made it to Sweden and was reunited there with us. In 1947, our family traveled from Sweden to France and then emigrated to Israel on board the ship Patrice Panama, which sailed from the city of Marseille. My father was a Zionist who had lived and worked several years in Palestine, in the British Mandate of Palestine, before being injured in a riot in Israel and returning to Poland to heal, meeting my mother, and beginning a family. So when we emigrated to Israel, he convinced the British that we were all, quote unquote, Palestinian, and we were caught in the war by surprise when we were visiting our family in Europe. That's how we were allowed into the country. Although the British government limited the number of Jews who could enter the country, since my father had lived and worked in Palestine for some time before the war, and he had papers, he was allowed to come in with us. We lived in a Bet Olim in Tel Aviv on Rehov HaAliyah. My younger brother RG was born there in 1947, while Israel was still called Palestine according to the British Mandate. My parents later settled down in Ramat Gan. She's talking about the grandparents. There's so much hate now in the world, so many people denying that it happened, denying that so many people died. I know my dad's grandparents, Eliezer and Chava, were murdered outside of their home in Landshut. They had a little home that had some fruit trees outside. Fruit trees are a really big deal for Jewish people because we love to be a contribution in the present and in the future. And while we may not eat from a fruit tree for the first 3 years of its life, we know that what we plant exists for the future later. Well, they were put outside of their house, outside of the pear tree that they had there in their front yard, and shot for being Jewish. There is so much that happened in those days, in the 30s and the 40s, that I thought we have gone beyond as people. I thought that was then and never again. The world knows better now. The world knows different. The world knows that there's humanity, that there is beauty in beings, that there's no need to just hate for hatred's sake. But after October 7th, 2023, on that day and beyond, I have seen, I have heard, I have been sickened by the marches calling to gas the Jews, to clean up the world, to continue hating. What future does that create? The word genocide came about after the Holocaust, where more than 6 million Jews were murdered, including 1 million kids simply for being Jewish, and including 7 million others, be they gypsies, be they political dissidents, be they so many different people, communists that the Germans didn't like. But based on the advice of the lovely Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who suggested to the Germans to create a quote-unquote final solution to the Jewish problem, murdering Jews en masse in a very mechanized, organized fashion was somehow okay. There were people who stood up. There were people who made different choices, people like Schindler, people like all sorts. Go to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and explore. See the groves of the righteous among the Gentiles, those who took people in, seeing the humanity in them and not the label. Seeing that although the world shouted for hate and for murder and for aggression, they could make a different choice. We could all make a different choice, and it's up to us, each of us, to make it. And what else is possible? This is 2 days before Holocaust Memorial Day, and we remember, and we never forget. And what else is possible beyond hatred, beyond separation, beyond the lies of blaming, of scapegoating? What do we know beyond all the stuff we've been indoctrinated to just hate? Oneness includes everything and judges nothing, includes everyone and judges no one. Yeah, evil is there too, but we can see it and we can rise above it, and we don't ever have to let it dictate our choice for the future that we'd like to create in the world. Every time we stand up to judgment, every time we stand up to hate, every time we stand up and say, no, not on my watch, something different is possible. So what are the infinite possibilities now and in the future? Thank you.